As we've covered before, in 1984, Gremlins would be released to theaters and would be a massive hit. Not only financially speaking, but just on a grander cultural level that would leave a cinematic footprint so large that it would usher in a new age of small-statured, mayhem-based monsters that, lasted up through the next decade. From Leprechaun to The Gate, Ghoulies, Spookies, Munchies, Hobgoblins, Elves, Rumpelstiltskin, Beasties, and a whole host of others, including the 1986 film that we are here to discuss today, Critters. A work that is, unlike most of the other ripoffs, actually quite good, and is almost able to stand as a work entirely on its own. But as we will see in my eyes, Critters is not all that unlike Gremlins, as to me it is a story of somewhat wasted potential, as while I think these films start strong enough for what they are, they quickly fizzle out to what ultimately ends up being a very lackluster franchise. As far as story is concerned here, there's little of that. Something which is common amongst most of the Gremlin successors, missing out in trying to pinpoint and recreate why that film was so beloved. It was not just the monsters, but also the characters, the Christmas atmosphere, the filmmaking artistry on display. Gremlins was just the whole package. Not that Critters is entirely lacking with those things. In particular, I do think that they try to make this have a distinct visual design. The opening credits almost call to mind the vibe of the excellent opening to Halloween 4, and the fashion decisions and the color schemes of the farmhouse that our family lives in does have a distinct flavor to it that makes it almost feel as if it is not entirely taking place within our own reality. This heightened idealization of the middle American normalcy by way of Norman Rockwell. From the way that Dee Wallace's character dresses to the Bruce Springsteen poster in the boys' bedroom, the wholesome Andy Griffith-like small-town sheriff who bumbles throughout the film in the most unhelpful manner possible, the cinematography of the farm itself, it is all clearly playing in this mythologizing of a particular idea of America that was never really real. It is clear that this is intended to almost be a lampoon of the idea of the traditional idea of the American aesthetic. But I think this concept could have been pushed further to better success, similarly to how Mars Attacks is very clear in what it is trying to talk about through its visual design. Very heightened, very exaggerated, almost drag. By not delving too far into the camp of it all, I believe that Critters at times inadvertently even ends up feeling a little bit fascist, venerating this American traditional kind of thing rather than lampooning it. For another example to look at, we can see how another contemporary film to this, the 1989 Bob Balaban horror film Parents, successfully mocks that style of 50s and 60s capital A American nuclear family with direct intention. While Critters does not go the distance with the extra mile, and the effect just doesn't quite hit the same. It's that whole satire should be evident as such, or else it will be confused to be endorsing that which it is satirizing whole deal. But getting back to the story, it follows the Brown family who are attacked by small space monsters called the Krites, who have escaped from an alien space prison planet by stealing an intergalactic ship, and have subsequently crash-landed it on Earth in their attempt to escape. The Browns have to navigate this fight for survival, while other people in the town struggle to believe that this threat is indeed actually real and is indeed actually happening to them. All the while contending with space bounty hunters, who have been sent to apprehend or kill the Krites for their unknown crimes. This aspect is actually something that is a big interest to me within the film. We're never actually told what the Krites did to wind up in such a state at the beginning of the film. We're just told that they are evil and that they belong in this prison. Which, the simplicity of this is fine, because ultimately this is a children's 80s horror film. But we're also not told anything about the bounty hunters or the people who are calling the Krites evil also. They could very well actually be the villains of this story, and the Krites might just be a less fortunate race, trying to escape space frontier colonialism for all we know. Which I understand is definitely not the intended reading on the part of the filmmakers. It isn't that deep. But this is to me nonetheless an interesting thought exercise to engage in while viewing things like this. The fact that we are told that these things are evil, but given no evidence as to why they should be considered evil enough to be deserving to be killed off en masse, leaves a vacuum of ambiguity that could be played with in a much more nuanced film. But nuance is not the name of the game here, and as I said, ultimately that's okay. This kind of stuff also sits in my mind in relation to the name of the film and the titular monsters, as the aliens are the only ones who ever actually say the word critters in this film, when referring to the Krites. None of the humans know that word, and as such, they don't use it, which definitely leaves the viewer assuming that critter is intended to basically be a racial slur for these creatures, which further serves to paint the non-Krite aliens in colonialist shades. I do also, from a storytelling perspective, like the style in which the inclusion of the aliens and science fiction elements are done within this film. A real rarity for me to enjoy in horror franchise filmmaking for the most part, as single offshoots like this, such as Jason X and Leprechaun 4, often leave much to be desired. It doesn't bring a ton to the table here as far as substance is concerned. It is literally just a fun intro with a few spaceships thrown in throughout. And similarly, if I'm being honest, I think in style, this also could have been made a more prominent aspect of this film, in a way that could conceivably have improved it, but I do also appreciate the attempt and do like what is here. The one drawback that I think I have comes in the form of the bounty hunters. They're these shapeshifters that take the form of humans when they get to Earth, and while I do really like the effects that depicts their change, I think this could have been a bit better if we just had full-blown aliens on Earth hunting these smaller fuzzy aliens. It takes, a bit of an artistic gamble to try and pull something like this off, but stuff like Psycho Gorman shows that an audience can really roll with non-human characters seriously in this kind of setting. It would have more solidified the space genre stuff that we're going for here. The other downside of this is that one of the bounty hunters takes the form of a pop idol rock star that he sees on the television. And this is done for two reasons. One is for an excuse to have him transform into a beautiful man for the rest of the picture, which I have no complaints about. Having more beautiful men has never harmed a movie before. But the downside to this is that it is used as an excuse to overplay a really bad rock song that they commissioned for the film. It plays 4 times in total, in a similar fashion to how New Year's Evil also uses its commissioned horrible tune. And I really wish they hadn't gone there with this route because this song is just awful. I just like aliens and would have liked to have seen more aliens in this space-themed horror film. But I don't want it to sound like I hate critters at all because that's actually far from the truth. I think it's an excellent example of how something like this can be done on a smaller than average budget, while still being a great deal of fun. This was directed by Stephen Herrick, who would go on to make other popular films such as Bill and Ted's Excellent Adventure and Mr. Holland's Opus. He's a talented studio director who knows how to use a camera in an economic way, and while there's not a ton of stylish stuff going on here on the technical end, what is here really does work. It feels confident in what it's delivering, and the cast are also doing their best with the material and are putting in a genuine effort to elevate this into something which is fun to watch. Dee Wallace was nearing the end of her 10 or so years of true genre fiction spotlight, and is as great here as she was in other films such as The Stepford Wives, The Hills Have Eyes, The Howling, E.T., Cujo, Popcorn, and Alligator 2. This was originally supposed to be made for much less money under Roger Corman's supervision, but at the last minute was changed to being a New Line film under Bob Shaye. Which is also why Lin Shaye makes a brief appearance in a few scenes as the police dispatcher, which ends up being one of the most memorable performances in the film. This came soon into New Line's rejuvenated interest in releasing horror films, coming right after their success with A Nightmare on Elm Street in 1984, just 2 years prior to this. As a work, Critters can almost be best understood as this weird crossroads moment between several other prominent works of horror cinema that are frankly better remembered than Critters is itself. Even if this was not intended to be the case, the filmmakers behind Critters have almost always seemed to have felt a bit self-conscious about what they made, insisting even decades later that no, this was not made to capitalize off the success of Gremlins, that no, this is not a ripoff and is a totally original idea that we came up with before Gremlins was even a thing. Why would you even ask that? Which may be totally true, and in all honesty, probably to an extent is, but the constant insistence that their work not be compared to a clear movement within horror based around small creatures, even though they include a nod to Ghoulies with the bit with the toilet, I think somewhat only served to have marred the film's legacy into this swamp of having no true identity for itself. Which is a shame because for its budget, it's actually quite a good time. This is also, in my opinion, connected to another film in a way, in that the 1993 film Leprechaun is essentially a soft remake or ripoff of Critters. They have the exact same aesthetics, the same comedic light tone, basically the same setups, with small monsters attacking a very capital A American farmhouse, where the country folks who live there have to fight for survival. A mentally handicapped adult who is best friends with a young farm boy who has a slingshot, who ultimately uses his toys to bring down the menacing threat. Although in Leprechaun, he uses the slingshot to kill the creatures, and in Critters, he uses his firecracker to blow up their spaceship. Thinking of this film as a cross between what would later be done on Leprechaun and Pumpkinhead is kind of a good way to get an idea of what they were going for here with this project. And, it's kind of a shame that Leprechaun is seemingly the more well-known of the two today, at least online amongst younger people from what I can tell, because Critters is the better film overall. It doesn't outshine Pumpkinhead, but few creature features would. As much as I love Leprechaun 2 and 3 and consider them to be the gold standard of that kind of bullshit no-money VHS cashing-in sequels, I actually don't really like the first Leprechaun, and it is in part because it is just doing everything that Critters already did, except all of it exponentially worse. And on the notion of it being a creature feature, we should speak on that because ultimately, this is the only reason why you're watching something like this. The characters, the writing, the filmmaking, all of it is subservient in the end to how fun a monster works on screen conceptually. And out of all of the really small monsters that came in this time period, I think the Critters are probably the second best just behind the Gremlins. At least in their early entries, that is. Now, the budget for this thing was only $3 million, and they really try to use clever design work to push that limited money as far as they could here. Such as when the critters move, they curl up into these little balls and roll away, and this is just achieved by the crew members literally rolling and throwing these things like cat toys. And you know this while watching it, it's like very apparent. But it doesn't matter, because it's fun and it works, and with the goofy tone, they just sell it. Now, in this though, I do have to say that I think it is a bit of a shame that the level of violence and general mayhem within the film is fairly muted from what I personally would like to see from something like this. And I would argue that harms the overall experience of the film. We see a gored cow early in the runtime that is a result of a run-in with the critters. But outside of that and a conflict with the farmer, basically all bodily harm and damage that they do is done off screen, which was done to achieve a PG-13 rating. And I do think that this holds not just the film back, but also the franchise at large. By establishing the first film as this PG-13 horror film, it really limits the place that we could go with our later sequels. And I'm somewhat of two minds about this. Because on one hand, the purist within me thinks that horror is a transgressive art form that should never try to preemptively self-censor itself, because the very act of doing so is going against the nature of it being transgressive in the first place. But on the other hand, the realist within me recognizes that in order for us to have a healthy horror film industry, things like this just need to exist. I myself was watching Silence of the Lambs and The Shining at an extremely young age, and I'm just personally of the opinion that movies are fictional, and kids watching R-rated movies has literally never harmed anybody. Kids are really good at knowing what they can and cannot handle, and if something scares them too much, they simply will not engage with it. But I also realize that not everyone thinks about media exposure in the same ways that I do, and things like this must exist to get kids interested in genre fiction from a young age so that they will then graduate into being adult horror fans. That is the only way we have a massive amounts of adults who are into horror, because it is generally something that a person ages into. And so, as much as I dislike them, Blumhouse existing is probably a part of a healthy film ecosystem that gets younger people interested in horror, and keeps them interested long enough that they can then transition into better and more adult-oriented horror films and works of art. Similarly to how I don't think that the constant barrage of musicals based on popular movies or shows is artistically interesting or boundary-pushing or really should be what theater is all about. But its existence arguably keeps actors and crew working, and probably facilitates the space for real art on Broadway to continue to function in the way that it does within the modern ecosystem. PG-13 horror should not be everything that is made, but PG-13 high school popcorn horror is a good thing for the industry as a whole. And if you care about the well-being of horror as a larger entity, then that must be acknowledged. The goal here is building a healthy, continuing, self-sustaining audience for horror, and part of that is catching them when they're young. Which is another reason that something like Goosebumps was such an important thing in the time that it existed, and also why new projects like that must be fostered again today. And so, as an audience member, I don't really like that this film does not push its creature feature content as far as it possibly could, while also recognizing that I'm not really the target audience for this exact movie. And also on top of that admitting that there are quite a lot of other horror films that do this too that I also love, like Tremors. One aspect that I do like about the Kreitz's monsters is directly related to their size, and that this film does what all other size monsters don't do, and that they can change size over the course of the film. This too is a similarity that they share or at least borrow seemingly from Gremlins, but where the Gremlins get mean when they eat, the critters get large. Really large in fact. With the biggest one basically being Grimace size before he gets put down by the bounty hunters, which is an aspect that I love. Grimace Critter is my favorite part of this movie. And I would have really liked to have seen this be pushed forward more. Like, how big can these things get? We could have had a Godzilla-style parody Critters movie. We could have really gone places with this aspect of the creatures. But instead, sadly, this is a part of their concept that would be abandoned in all future sequels to their detriment. This is the only Critters movie where they get bigger, which I think is kind of bullshit. Now, it's not like they don't do other fun things with them, as we will see, but to totally get rid of an aspect that is cemented here within the first film, that is also not explored much here until the very end, that could have been explored in multiple different unique and versatile scenarios. I think it's just, a bit of a shame that they didn't do that. But overall, everything about this project, really, it just works. I love at the end of the film when the bounty hunters are trying to set things right after the Kreitz have been destroyed, and they rebuild their home after blowing it up in the battle, and it's just clearly just footage of the home being destroyed played in reverse. Just fun stuff like that works in the favor of what they're trying to do here. The film would be released in the spring of 1986, and would go on to make a return on investment, and end its theatrical run with $13 million at the box office, and a sequel would soon follow. But before we get to that, if you enjoy my work and would like to support me on Patreon, you can do so by going to patreon.com/praiseofshadows. There you can get early access to all of my work and input onto some of my future projects that I take on. You can also find my second channel, IPOS Dark Sides, where I make individual smaller videos focused on single movies. Also, I'd like to say that I'm back on Twitter again, and so if you'd like to follow me over there, you're welcome to do so. Today I'd personally like to thank Ernie Crute, Freddie Velez, Garrett Gillette, Gloom, Haru Nicole, Huntress Warlock, and Jean-René Legace. Critters 2, which would release 2 years later in 1988, is by almost every metric a better film than the first one is, and sadly seems to be known even less. It is a tight 85-minute package that completely understands the name of the game here, and that game is pure franchise sequel filmmaking, where we take what existed before us that had been created by entirely different people, and then build on top of that, mythologize it, mold a formula out of it, and to view it cynically, capitalize off of that work that came before us. This time around, the project was written and directed by Mick Garris, who is an artist that I've always greatly admired, and have also always thought that he had a strange career made up of unconventional and weird decisions, but usually ones that at least somewhat worked. He always took big swings that others would not be so inclined to do, and for that alone, you've got to respect him. He is basically the guy that Eli Roth wanted to be, which is to be someone who knows a great deal of horror film history, and started working in that, who eventually transitioned into cheap horror films that have a unique identity to them. He made documentary work showcasing the making of The Thing, as well as The Fog, before making his feature debut with this project. He would go on to write Hocus Pocus, and direct other work such as The Shining and Steen miniseries, as well as Sleepwalkers, Psycho 4, and Desperation, as well as spearheading the famous Masters of Horror dinners, and creating the show of the same name. He has a name that should simply invoke a certain reverence. I think anybody who is daring enough to say that they're going to readapt The Shining not even 20 years after Kubrick's film should at least be respected for being willing to attempt things that few others would touch. It demonstrates a total lack of giving into artistic fear or insecurity, and really just fucking goes for it. And it is great to see him so early in his career here working on Critters 2. Structurally, this is basically just a remake of that first film, except this time better. We start with a sci-fi opening, we return to the farmhouse, the critters attack the town, and everybody has to band together with some space bounty hunters to fend them off. There's a very clear formula here, but that isn't a negative if you can pull it off, which this does. It all just lives and dies by how fun it is, and what new concepts they bring to the table, and Garris here with Critters 2 does great with both of those criteria. With our sci-fi opening, we start with one of the most compelling aspects with this film as a text, which is its attitudes towards gender and presentation. As we find out that one of the shape-shifting bounty hunter aliens from the last time has not reverted to their natural state and remains in this somewhat androgynous 80s glam rock form. Their partner, however, has gone back to being a formless, genderless mass of flesh, stating that they did not like the figure of the cop that they took on with the last film, with one of them saying in this conversation that it is important for the individual to feel at home within the body and identity that is right for them, which is just weirdly progressive for 80s schlock horror, and I love to see it. And while this concept is used within the film as a justification to have some sexually exploitative shots thrown in, as the formless partner then takes on the presentation of an 80s porn star, it still is demonstrating a being that we once saw as a man in the first film, who then takes it upon themselves to take on the role of a woman in the second film. Do I think that Critters 2 is trying to say some grand pro-trans statement? No, I don't think that it is. But I do think that through this, it is inadvertently saying something compelling about the notions of presentation and gender expression, in that particular way that sci-fi really lends itself well to. Although in this, the film does seemingly make a dick joke about her that I don't really know how to read into, as before a battle starts late into the film, she holds up her gun next to her pelvic region, and then it expands before she starts to blast it off. And this is also doubly interesting when she finds that this form no longer suits her, and then again transforms to take on the visage of the local nerd, showing that this entity is experimenting with different ways to present itself throughout the film until it finds something that they're comfortable with. So the last film ends with a final sequel-baiting shot revealing that even though the critters have been vanquished, that their ship has been destroyed and their bodies reduced to a pulpy, hairy goo, they have in secret laid eggs that will soon hatch and again wreak horrible mayhem on the unsuspecting townspeople of Grover's Bend. And so this film is the Egg Movie, and wouldn't you know it, it just happens to be Easter, which is an idea that is so stupid that it somehow wraps back around again to just being totally brilliant and inspired. We have a woman who finds the unhatched eggs and she just thinks they're really neat, so she paints them and distributes them to all the children in the town during the Easter egg hunt. And you can probably see through this why I like the movie so much. It's a lot more mean-spirited. We get children in peril, we get bright colors, and it's shot in the daylight because it's supposed to be Easter Sunday, which is a little sacrilegious in a fun way. It's just really campy. The whole vibe of it is kind of perfect. In this vein, I do want to mention that I also really appreciate that Lin Shaye returns for this one in an even more ridiculous outfit than she had on the first time. Almost every movie would be improved by having at least one character have such daring fashion senses. She sadly would not return for any other entry in the franchise, to their detriment, and trust me when I say they could have really used her in the sequels. And while we're talking about returning characters, I do have to mention that the bumbling idiot sheriff named Harv returns in this entry but is now played by actor Barry Corbin. And to me, this comes across as one of the only self-conscious acts that the film commits. It almost feels panicked that they didn't have enough of the original cast members agreeing to return, despite it taking place soon after the first film. And so they included him to make it feel more connected to that original entry. Because if he wasn't in this, I really don't think that anyone would realistically be going into Critters 2 after watching the first one and saying to themselves, well, hold your horses, where the fuck is Harv? Fan favorite, beloved franchise character, Sheriff Harv. We need him back, bring him back. Charlie also does return in the form of a kind of de facto main character in this movie. And in sliding into that new position, he is no longer the special needs coded person that he was in the first film. Which, if we're going to bring him back, I guess dropping that aspect of his character is an improvement. But I think an overall better decision would have just been to have dropped him from the series, and pretend that this wasn't an aspect from the first movie, because it wasn't great then, and has only aged to be even more horrible in time. Especially because they bring him back not only for this film, but also for 3 and 4, and then they proceed to do nothing interesting with him in any of them. One last thing to note with the cast is that the off-putting kid from Polar Express is in this, also playing the local town nerd that I mentioned earlier. And I just think that's neat. I always love to see him pop up and stuff. I love when a film embraces someone with an unconventional face or vibe to them. I think every movie should have weirdos in them. He was also in Dexter's Lab, which I love, where he played Mandark. Everything involving the critters in this is just so much better this time around, to the point that it's not even funny. This feels like an actual real movie with a real budget, despite only costing $1 million more. At least according to the listed budgets on Wikipedia, which says that this one only cost $4 million to make. Which compared to other creature features from this time was considerably small, as Tremors had a $10 million budget, The Blob also had $10 million, The Fly had $15 million, and Gremlins had $11 million. So what they were able to do with that and how they stretched it is genuinely impressive. Although I did see a reference where Mick Garris said that 2 had double the budget of the first one, so those listed budgets may be incorrect, or maybe he's confused and misremembering details several decades removed from making this. Who knows? But even so, if it was $6 million, that is still considerably lower than its contemporary competitors. By making the film centered around Easter, the camp bright colors and lighting work in their favor somewhat, along with a little more blood than we got the last time, to really make that PG-13 work better this time around. Also, this film, unlike its predecessor, just said, fuck it. If people are going to compare us to Gremlins anyways, then we might as well just embrace it, and be as wild and chaotic as that film was. And that attitude greatly helps this project, as it's a good time that does not feel like it kind of hates itself for simply existing. Although I'll add that while the effects are very much improved here, you do occasionally see some very obvious wires being used, where you couldn't in the first film, and it does come across as occasionally distracting. I also love that Garris uses the first film to build off of. In that film, we clearly see that the critters will eat raw cows if they get hungry. They just prefer humans. And so in this one, the main characters use beef to draw them into a trap. That's what franchise filmmaking is all about. I love to see it, taking something to its next goofy, logical step of progression. It seems small, but so many of these sequels falter when it comes to these small details, so you just love to see when someone does it well and understands the role that they've been given. I also love the iconic giant Indiana Jones style ball of critters that strips the flesh off of anyone that it rolls over. Such a great idea, so fun. Really, the only thing that I don't like about all of this is that it ends with a title card that reads, "The filmmakers would like to thank the people of Grover's Bend, without whose support this motion picture could not have been made." Which is just really strange to me and is a joke that does not land. Is it supposed to be insinuating that this really happened? Are they supposedly making a film based on true events? It's a joke that leaves you wondering what the punchline even is, and sort of just leaves you on a confused note instead of wrapping all of this up in a competent way. I really wish they hadn't have done this. 3 years later, we would get Critters 3, which would do the thing that most of these franchises would do in this period of time, which is to transition to working with a substantially smaller budget with a new release model of going direct to the VHS market, skipping theaters entirely. To save money, this was filmed on a soundstage they had built in a closed-down Walmart-style big box store, and was shot at the exact same time as Critters 4. And from what I can tell, the budgets for Critters 3 and 4 combined were about equal to the amount of money that they were working with when they made the first film. Working in this new soundstage was both a benefit and a harm to the production. They could shoot as much as they wanted to, but with that came limitations of space and range of shots that could be pulled off, which resulted in both of these films feeling smaller in scope in just about every way that you can imagine. Also, because they were essentially filming in a closed-down Walmart instead of an actual soundstage, they ran into issues constantly that were not expected, such as their pyrotechnic setting off the alarms and sprinkler system. Although, I guess one could say that the nature of filmmaking is the nature of running into unexpected issues. So, stuff like this is somewhat universal to almost every film that has ever been made, just unique to the individual productions. The movie is an ultimately passable and somewhat safe entry that basically does what a lot of these sequels decided to do. More of the same, change the location a little bit, but also don't fundamentally rock the boat in any ways that matter. You may say to me that that's just what I said about Critters 2 and that I like that one, and you're kind of right. But it all comes down to how fun and successful you work within that pre-established formula, and this to me misses that mark quite a bit. If you enjoy the Critters, this one is more of that, which is fine, but it also won't surprise you really in any way and doesn't aim to go above and beyond. This time we have the Critters getting into a vehicle that is traveling across the country, and then infecting an apartment building in the city that the family lives in. The initial idea here was, what if we took the Critters out of the small town setting and then released them instead in New York City? But this was then changed to a singular city-associated location with the apartment building, after considering the negative fan reception to 1989's Jason Takes Manhattan, where, because of the realities of the smaller budget, they would only be able to include a few shots that were actually filmed in New York proper, like that film did to universal ridicule. So to avoid that, they instead just had it take place here, which was probably the right call. I think it's a fun setting, and I have no issues with this. I like that this also allowed them to embrace types of bodies that are not usually shown on screen in these types of monster survival movies. We have heavier people, very old people, very young children. It isn't just hot people in their 20s and 30s, which I recognize and really appreciate the attempt and effort here with that, even if some of the character writing could have been a little bit stronger. I actually also surprisingly do appreciate that this time it feels more like an outright project that is designed solely for kids. It's giving Disney Channel original movie, but with that comes some downsides as well, such as an extended sequence where the Critters take turns farting and then laughing about it. But there are other aspects that have that tone that I think are quite fun, such as someone who is trying to call for help after being suspended by a rope, and they just can't quite reach this payphone. It's a goofy gag, but adds tension. I've always argued in defense of horror aimed at children, and I'd much rather have something fully embrace this goofy tone, usually relegated to late-stage sequels, rather than just be a fence-sitter with a PG-13 rating. To me, it's the difference between having a personal identity and not. And maybe that's an irrational take, maybe I'm just crazy, but it's still how I feel about it. But with this change in location, I'd really like to see in something like this an elevation or evolution of what the Critters can be, which this does not deliver on at all. Not to speak on the quality of the films themselves, but the Tremors movies really knew how to handle this problem. Every single film, they made sure to introduce some sort of new biological fact about the graboids that changed how our heroes have to approach a battle with them. This is how this kind of thing should just be done. But we don't really get that here outside of a single moment where one of the Critters screeches loudly to call for his friends to come help. which I guess is something. It's fine. One thing that I will say about the monsters themselves, they look better than they ever have here, which is due to 2 reasons. The first is actually because the budget here was smaller. Critters 1 and especially Critters 2 had larger budgets that they used to make a great deal of critter puppets for. They could be used for different scenarios. But here in these 2 films, they made roughly 8 to 10 puppets that could be used and then reused over and over again on both films. And because they were making so few of them, they could really focus in on the detail work and make each one interesting and unique. Animatronics had also improved by this point in time, and this new technology allowed them to have more convincing movements in a lot of these scenes. I feel like the eyes in particular look really convincing and lively in ways that they just simply weren't before. With this though, I will say that I really do not like that this film basically abandons any of the sci-fi aspects that were all over the first 2 films. Charlie shows up at the end to save the day, and still has his space bounty hunter weapons from part 2. And there's an after-credits scene that features a call from space that ties the ending of this film into the beginning of the next one. But outside of that, there's no other elements like this. And I think that this is a shame that results in a blander film that is not true to what I see as the spirit of the franchise. But still, all things considered at the end of the day, even though I don't love this, it does on paper have a lot of what you'd want from a VHS sequel in the middle of a horror franchise. You've got bizarre side characters that talk in ambiguous accents, bowling ball sound effects when the critters get hit with a trash can. You've got an old woman wielding a massive meat cleaver, a small child falling backwards in slow motion as he tumbles to his certain death off the top of the tall roof. A younger future star Leo DiCaprio in his first feature film role wearing the most 90s patterned shirt you could imagine. I love shit like this. There needs to just be more of it. Every person destined for fame should be forced to be in a bad horror movie sequel that has the number 3 or greater at the end of its title. Also, despite only being in this for a few minutes, as you can predict, almost every copy of this movie that has been sold since like 1995 has had his face on the cover of it. Critters 4, which as we already said was made at the exact same time as Critters 3 to save money, is basically the opposite of that film in ways that really should work for me, even though I would sadly have to agree with the general consensus of how this ended up turning out, as it is often seen as the worst thing that has come out of the franchise. This time around, they decided to do 2 different things that I think could have really pushed the franchise forward with a better concept and script. The first is to really embrace its sci-fi roots, and the second, trying to make the critters more upsetting and attempt to create an entry in the franchise that pushes this more into the territory of being an outright horror film, rather than a family-oriented PG-13 horror comedy. But in execution, none of this works in any way imaginable. Now, I will say that the film makes you think that it at first might end up being pretty good, even if what it is giving you is derivative as hell. The opening credits are surprisingly artful. It's kinda serving Blade Runner in tone. And then we fade into this kid on this spaceship juggling the world, and you really get an idea that we might just be in for something kinda cool here. Only for it to end up being the worst Critters movie that has ever been made by far. It is essentially torture to actually sit through this thing. I think that one of the worst things that a film can be is boring. I will take an awful execution of an original idea any day of the week over something that is so painfully middle of the road like this is. I also do try to not be an asshole. Believe it or not, that is important to me, but I really think this might be one of the worst films I've ever had to review for the channel. This actively gave me a headache trying to focus on it. Like, I'm literally not kidding when I say that I had to take a Tylenol and a short nap after finishing this. So, to put it simply, this is just a hardcore Alien ripoff. The critters get on a human spaceship, they hide for a long time, and then start to pick off the crew one by one, as paranoia and panic starts to rip through the ship like shrapnel. It literally is just a beat-for-beat bad remake of Alien, down to the ship blowing up in the exact same way at the end and the chains hanging from one of the rooms of the ship, which is just such a stupid idea for a number of reasons. The main one being that anyone who has seen Alien will not really have a good time here, which is most people. But also, the idea of going back to the science fiction roots of the series is exciting to me, but with this comes some trepidation. Jason X, Hellraiser 4, Leprechaun 4, there's really not a lot of great examples of horror franchises going to space and then being successful with it, right? But if one could, I think it might be Critters. The first sequence of the first movie is in the space prison, and it's great. The foundational groundwork is already there, but they opt for a totally different tone and style here in trying to emulate Alien, as the space aesthetics from before are way more Star Wars and Doctor Who than anything else. Why are all of our characters in this human? We were clearly shown before that humans are on Earth, but that the entities in space are all these weird, colorful monsters. Can you imagine how much more fun this would be if it was all costume characters, and there were not really any real people in it? Because I actually do think that you could get away with something like that. Even if it was a massive failure, I can assure you that it would at least be an improvement and be more memorable than whatever this is. Like, you know, at least embrace what is weird about your franchise instead of trying to do somebody else's badly. And on that note, while we're talking about Alien, this is the style in which the critters themselves are handled in this, in that they do not appear until an agonizing 37 minutes into this movie, even though it feels as if 5 hours have passed before they show up. And then they are only on screen for a few moments before the end of the film. I'd actually be genuinely curious to know exactly how many seconds they appear in the film. I'd wager it's probably around 100, maybe. And I hope you can see why this is a problem. So I know that this might be a controversial thing to say, but I really think that the whole Jaws and Alien concept, that the monster is better when we can't see it, is total, complete, and absolute bullshit. I hate it. Probably one of my most controversial opinions is that I don't even really like Jaws all that much. Because of this. I think it's just okay. I think Jaws is fine. Like, this kind of thing has a time and place, that's undeniable. Lovecraft adaptations, sure, if done in an appropriate style, I guess. It works for Alien, it works for The Thing, cosmic horror things in general. But by and large, if I'm going to see a monster movie, then I am paying to see a monster in action. I want to see it for like at least half the runtime. I want to see it kill people every 5 minutes. I want total, absolute mayhem. That is what I'm there for. Unless you've got a really original and artful take. That's what I'm paying to see. But in this, I understand the realities of the limitations of what it means to make art on a scale of time and money. And with that comes this problem with movies like this where effects do cost money to develop. And there's just this extent to where we can push that. And so with these small budget ones, there's just usually a lot of downtime with bullshit conversations that go absolutely nowhere, that are built off of tropes that you've seen 60 times over by now, that are only being used to kill time until we can hit that golden 90-minute mark, rather than for any other dramatic purposes related to, you know, actual character work. And this suffers hard from this. Okay, so I know this sounds insane when I say it, but there is a substantial difference between movies where characters sit around talking about nothing that matters at all, and movies where characters sit around talking about nothing that matters at all. And by that, I mean there are movies like Trainspotting that largely consist of just the dumbest guys that you know, sitting in a circle saying the most mundane, dumb guy smart things that they can think of. And it ends up being one of the best films ever made because of that. Similar to like, you know, The Sopranos and a million other things out there. But then there's movies like this, where the same thing happens, but we're talking about made-up space drama stuff that is so one-note and meaningless that when you try and focus on it, your eyes just glaze over and you disassociate for 10 minutes, and then you get lost as to what is even fucking happening. And to their credit, the cast is trying hard here, and is weirdly stacked too. I mean, we've got our two leads being Angela Bassett and Brad Dourif, but even they can't save this disaster. Eric DeRay from Twin Peaks is here in one of his few screen appearances, basically being hired to just play Leo Johnson again, as he raids the ship's pharmacy looking for drugs. But I don't even mind that because I do love seeing him. I guess what I'm trying to say here with all of this is that all bad movies, for the most part, start with bad scripts. Some of the best movies ever made have been actors sitting in a room talking with each other, which is one of the cheapest things that you can film. These types of movies do not have to be bad. That's a decision that was made. There are ways to make that absolutely riveting, even within a tired setting like a remote spooky space station. There are just ways to do this well. But like a great deal of horror franchises, a bad rushed script really harms these later sequels. It is just noticeably worse to me in the Critters movie than it might be in some other franchises. Because to me, I think that these later movies totally lack any veneer of real effort, and the Critters themselves are not interesting enough to carry the brunt of that like, say, the Cenobites are. There's largely no sincerity here, no desire to make anything genuine. And it's not helped in that very few people have a great fondness or love for the Critters movies. So it absolutely does not matter if the movie was even good or not. One of the few films I've ever seen that really does feel totally, absolutely artless. And when it does decide to try and make some creative decisions, it also just does them in such a weird way. Like Ugg, the space bounty hunter, shows up at the end of this, but now he's inexplicably very evil and antagonistic to the humans in a way that he's never been before, which is a complete rewrite and betrayal of the character as he was depicted in the previous movies, which would be absolutely fine if it was in the service of doing something interesting, but it isn't. And it does that thing that should never ever be done in a franchise monster movie, which is to destroy the last of the species with the ship explosion at the end. This should never be done under any circumstances. Horror franchise filmmaking is like improv. It is a game of yes and. It is picking up the story, the toys, at the point where the last person left off, and then leaving them in such a position as to where the next person will have an easy and seamless time picking them up and running with what has been done up until this point. It's a very simple rule, and anything like blowing up the supposedly last critters in existence creates an awkward time for whoever has to then step in and make the next one of these things, because they either have to just ignore that happened, or take precious time in their movie to explain why these weren't actually the last of the critters, and why your movie didn't even actually matter. Which, is not ideal in either instance, but for very different reasons. And so many of these franchise movies needlessly make this mistake. So many of them are only thinking about the current movie, and not the ramifications on if this thing's gonna continue, which most of them inevitably do. But I guess I should say a few nice things about Critters 4 because I was a bit of an asshole about it. If we try and look at it through that John Waters thing, where if you view any movie like an art gallery made up of individual smaller works of art, then you will find beauty and value in any film. I think that's an important rule to at least try to live by. As I said, I like the cast. They're not at fault for this thing at all. They're trying hard. The music is occasionally surprising and weirdly inspired. I love the woodsy room with the fake grass, the use of smoke, and occasional clever uses of lighting. Like at times, there is some intention here, even if that intention is to emulate a cool thing that already existed in a better and more enjoyable form. And there is an actual legitimate great shot in here that demonstrates some very clever monster filmmaking, where these two puppets are on screen and they duck under this desk, and then they roll two different puppets away to create this fun, silly, seamless effect. I actually find this moment to be very funny and clever, and I actually do love it. I'm not all that hard to please, but very little of this does anything for me at all. And you know what? Maybe I've not been entirely fair here. Maybe I've let some external things in my life impact how I feel. We just hit that once every financial quarter where I willingly let a man I shouldn't trust break my little heart. And time goes on and time goes on and videos still have to be made. And so old Zanye's just gotta pick up the pieces and still has to watch Critters 4, so you never know. So what follows next is interesting, in that something happened here that I don't think I've ever come across with another horror franchise. So 27 years pass with no new Critters entries, and then in 1 year we have two different competing Critters films made by two different groups of people who each owned different parts of the rights to the franchise, which is such a dumb outcome to end all of this with. So we're gonna start with Critters: A New Binge, which is called that because even though it's basically the same length as a movie, it was released as 8 to 9 minute episodes. Actually though, since it was only 8 episodes long, it technically isn't even traditional modern film length. And the word binge is in the title because of the whole streaming thing we're about to get into, but also with the critters eating and there's a hot dog contest in the movie, it sort of thematically ties it all together. Talks of a Critters internet series started back in 2014, but resulted in nothing. But it seems like Shudder, which was really only just gearing up here, was looking for original content to make. And this became one of the first Shudder original things. And I imagine that it was done in episodes like this instead of a movie so that it could help to legitimize them as an actual streaming service that could compete with other services by saying that they also had television shows and that they were not just a movie platform. That is just me guessing, but I imagine I'm fairly right there. Okay, so straight up, this is one of the most insane things that I have ever seen be done with a pre-established legacy franchise. Like, this is the kind of thing that you could only get away with something like Critters because nobody gives a shit about it, and nobody's gonna be upset at you for fucking up their favorite series. Every single creative decision that this thing makes is actually wild. That doesn't mean that it's good though. This thing has like Quibi original series written all over it. It's so shitty that it's not even on Shudder anymore. I had to watch it on Plex. But like, at least it's doing something original here. It is so shoddy in execution, but in that it is charming to watch, which certainly can't be said for the fourth one. And in truth, this is probably my second or third favorite entry in the series. There are parts of this that are essentially on par with a Drag Race sketch, and that's kind of what I love about it. It's got really fake green screen backdrops, some of the worst looking CGI in existence, and Gilbert Gottfried is here for some reason, and he clearly just does not give a fuck about any of this. He's supposed to be playing the kind, loving uncle character, but he looks legitimately horribly depressed to be in this. But despite all of this, they are trying some new stuff here. This is the first time that we spend time from the critters' perspective. We learn about their home planet and their politics, and they're on a mission to Earth to retrieve one of their own. And in this spy mission, we get a lot of great stupid gags, like one of them putting on a tiny hat so that he can pretend to be this rich guy's chauffeur, or this other one becoming addicted to cigarettes. We've got the critters using a giant catapult to launch them into battle. The return of the critter ball. Each one of them has real attention put into their small characteristics and details. We've got a Matrix spoof with a tiny black trench coat. This very much is Critters by way of star Magic Jackson Jr. And this is all in the service of one of the dumbest and wildest things I've ever seen one of these movies do, where our main high school aged protagonist, Christopher, has always been made fun of for his weight and having an insane appetite. And the twist near the end of the movie is that his secret that he hides from the world is that his mother back in the 90s had sex with the president of the Critters and became pregnant from that, and that Christopher is actually a human Krite hybrid who is the prince who will inherit the Critter Empire. But he decides to stand with the humans who he was raised amongst, which sets up a sequel that would never be made, where it is teased that the critters have made an army of clones of him that he will have to fight. And lastly, we're left with Critters Attack, which unfortunately, similarly, doesn't work for similar reasons. I really do hate that the back end of this video is so negative. Apologies for that. I actually do try and avoid that from happening. But this franchise really falls off the rails hard after 3 and is never able to recover. This is a weird one because it's a legacy sequel to an 80s movie and is pandering off of nostalgia for that, but is also Critters in a post-Stranger Things world. So that nostalgia is actually filtered through the lens of how Stranger Things approached nostalgia. Like, we have this opening surrounding riding bikes, which I know there's a bike in that first movie, so it does serve as an appropriate callback to that. But by this point, Stranger Things and It very much cemented a person being on a bike in a horror movie as being very 80s coded. The music here is also very similar in tone at times as to how that show approached its music. And again, it is weirdly just another example of Critters trying to do someone else's franchise rather than just engaging with their own. The main plot is also very much a mashup of the story of 11 from Stranger Things with flavors of E.T. and Gremlins, where these kids find an albino female critter that is actually kind-hearted that they have to protect. Now, in this rip-off style, I admit that some of it is done well. I mostly like their use of lighting and the music, which, while cliched at this point, is still usually effective. And even if what they are doing is just clearly gizmo-coded, I do like the white critter. Weird variations like this are what these movies needed to be doing all along. And with this, we will get a new rule that the critters do not like high-pitched noises, which is a bit of a retcon, but at least they're attempting to play with giving us something that we haven't seen in these movies before. And I also like just how non-white the cast is. It's a rare thing to find deep into one of these franchises, and it's something that I notice and appreciate. But there was clearly no money involved in this project. Largely at times, it has the tone and stylistic flares of a Lifetime movie. There are scenes that really try and push their visuals, and then there are other scenes that legitimately look like they're just porn. And they have overall a problem with consistency there. But they're trying to at least make something watchable. We get a lot of time with the critters, we get a lot of violence and kills, and in this, it is probably the grossest that the critters have ever looked on an individual level, with nasty bald patches and stuff like that. They also bring back the critter ball as well, and I love that both competing 2019 entries knew that this was such an iconic thing that had to return. But so much of this is just a really hard scent. Not only is it bland, but it also at times is just lazy and uncreative. Like this shot where this prop clearly fucks up and doesn't work in the way that it was intended to, but they still just use that take anyways instead of refilming it. Also, Dee Wallace returns for this one, but with that, however the rights shook out, they didn't actually have the rights to reuse her character from the first movie. And so in this one, she's playing an ambiguous woman named Aunt Dee, who has a history with the critters that she's not allowed to talk about. It just doesn't work and is horribly distracting, and I kind of hate it when things do that. Like, I recently started reading Maeve Fly, and it's a good book, but it's clearly supposed to take place at Disneyland, and they couldn't actually say that, and so they keep saying copyright ambiguous things like the park, the castle, the blue princess, stuff like that, which is open enough to where you still clearly know what they're talking about, but are doing so in a way that is legally fine. And to me as an audience member, it just becomes annoying, more than transgressive or anything like that. And with that, we're up to the present day. And ultimately, if I'm being fully upfront, I outright think they should just fully stop making these movies. This doesn't need to be a thing anymore. I don't think there's anything that's actually going to save this franchise, that is very much just spinning its wheels. I think it is just so totally washed by this point that they really shouldn't attempt any more of these. Because at the end of the day, even when they were good, it did all start out as a blatant cash grab to capitalize off the success of a better comedy horror movie. And you know me, normally I end these things by saying that I'm excited to see where they go from here. Because I genuinely really do see potential in a lot of these things most of the time. But in this instance, I really think that this is just something that should be left in the past and remembered for the oddity that it is.
It's a lovely day outside, and I know you're now with him. You said to go away, not to bother you again. Such a lovely springtime day, there's a Caldwell purple wren. Wonder if he'd sing to me, if I'd feel alright again. Ooh, and my mind is craving for the thought of the lasting memories that I've got. Walking in the spring, the love meant everything. I reached out for your hand, and love was also grand. Summer through the fall, our lives were just a ball. And that was yesterday, the wind blew it away. Now each day is kind of special, marks the time that you